So in a lot of C++ programs, you'll see using namespace standard at the top, which we use so that we don't have to use the scope resolution operator to get to cout, end of line, and so forth. Probably up until this point, you just did it because you knew that that is something you could do. But it turns out namespaces are actually a feature of C++. We're going to see in this video an example of how we can use namespaces in our code. So I've written this program that has the area and perimeter function for a square, and then I have a print function that'll print the side of the square, the perimeter, and the area. So if I compile this and then run, you can see that I passed 10 to the print function, so it said a square of side 10, perimeter equals 4, 100 equals 4. And I could also, if I wanted to, call the area or perimeter function individually. Again, you'll notice it doesn't know what cout is, so I need to put the scope resolution operator on there. So I can compile this as well and run it, and you can see that the area of a square with side of 4 is 16. Now suppose I want to add functions for a rectangle. So the area of a rectangle, it's going to have a length and a width, and the area is going to be length times width. And the perimeter, actually I need to return this, don't I? And I'll put everything in parentheses just because I like to do that for clarity's sake. And I think that all lines up, so there we go. I'll update this line. Now you may be wondering why we're not getting a duplicate function definition error. And the reason for that is C++ is able to differentiate between the two area functions based on their function signature. However, suppose I wanted to do this for a circle. So the area is pi times r squared. And the perimeter is 2 times pi times r. And I'll need to define pi, so I'll do that up here, which will be close enough for our purposes. So now let's compile. And you'll notice it gives me an error, redefinition of function area. Because notice now area and perimeter have the same signatures for both my square and circle functions. So I need some way to differentiate those. And I could say, well, this is square area, square perimeter. This is circle area, circle perimeter. But that's a little ugly. I can actually use namespaces here. So all of this code is for a square. All of this code is for a circle. And I can put each of these in a namespace. I'll call this namespace square. And I'll need to close it here. And I'll call this namespace circle. And now I can also add a print method to my circle namespace that'll print information about a circle. So now I can differentiate these functions using the scope resolution operator. So I have a missing that. I think that should resolve that problem. And I'm missing a closing bracket somewhere. And it's this print function. And notice that the print function call is a problem too, because there's now no print function that exists outside of a namespace. So I have to use the scope resolution operator. So if I say square print 10, now it knows what to call. So here, we're using these namespaces to say, hey, when I use the namespace square, I want these methods. When I use this namespace circle, I want these functions. And so the namespace is basically a way to collect some functions that have common usefulness. And the idea is very similar to a class, except there's no member variables here. I don't have to instantiate an object to use these functions. So I'll use both namespace print functions here. I'll also here, in this part of the code, I'll call area and perimeter for both square and a circle. And I'll make a note that I'm calling the area and perimeter functions here. So let's compile, let's run, and you'll notice when I call the square print function, I get this information. When I print the circle one, I get this. And I see a bug already. This should be an int. And I also should capitalize this because since I'm making it a constant, it should be all caps just to indicate that. A couple things. First off, I'm not using pi anywhere outside of circle. So I'm going to add that constant here. Now, since this is a compile time constant, it's getting generated once the program compiles, but you still can't use it outside of the namespace. So for example, suppose I want to print out what pi is. You'll notice pi is undefined. And if I compile this, you notice pi is not defined. I have to add the scope resolution operator to indicate that I want the pi from the circle namespace. What namespaces allow us to do is group common things together and then specify which of those things we want to do. So there's a lot of area and perimeter functions we might want to use, and area and perimeter are good names for those. And so namespaces allow us to reuse the same names for different entities. And again, the scope resolution operator says I'm going to be using the functions from that namespace. Suppose I do using namespace standard here. So now I can delete the scope resolution operator off of the things from the standard namespace here, but only inside of the square namespace. If I try to do it here, I'm still going to get the unknown identifier because it needs the scope resolution operator. I'm only using namespace standard inside of square. That using namespace standard doesn't apply to the rest of the file. It only applies to this namespace. And suppose I want to mix and match things from the same interface. Suppose I want to call a function circle square that takes an integer and it's going to print and then for a square, it's going to print the perimeter. Now, neither of these functions are known because I don't have the scope resolution operator here, so it doesn't know what namespace these are in. It doesn't know where these functions are. They're not defined in the current namespace. I can actually specify that I'm using circle area and square perimeter. So now when it gets this area, it knows that it's circle area because I set up here, when I'm using the area function from the circle namespace, I'm using the perimeter function from the square namespace. And you can see when I hover over, it knows that the perimeter is from square, the area is from circle. And I put that in a weird spot, so let me move that down so that it's out of the namespace definitions. And I think that's a better place for it. And then let's call the function circle square 7, circle square 3, and there's something it doesn't like. Looks like I misspelled it. There we go. So you can see that it calls the function with 7 and 3, getting the radius of a circle and the perimeter of the square. And I think I let this still be an int. So let's make that a double so that I get a little bit better output. And then let me change this to double as well. And I think since we're using a double, that should give us the result we're looking for. And it does. So I'll add some comments before I upload this file, but hopefully this gives you an idea of what namespaces are. Again, there's a design decision if you want to use a namespace or a class for a certain thing. If you have just a collection of functions, it might make sense to put them in a namespace instead of a class.